choice that will define the future of a region that served as the cradle of civilization and a crucible of strife.
We begin our headlines tonight in Egypt, Israel, Jerusalem, Gaza Strip, the West Bank, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Gulf states. A lion that was rescued from the abandoned zoo in Syria has given birth to a cub just hours after.
In the pursuit of a broader peace and peace with the Palestinians. And I greatly look forward to discussing this in detail with you, Mr. President.
Hi, my name is Gemma Neary and welcome to this week's edition of The Modern Middle East. Throughout the show, we'll explore the key principles and misconceptions of Islam. We'll be joined by a critically acclaimed stand-up comedian, and we'll finish with a feature travel story about a children's performer who was commissioned to work in Saudi Arabia. But first, let's look at what's been happening in the Middle East. We begin our headlines in Gaza tonight, where a ceasefire was brokered between Israel and the controlling power of the Strip, Hamas, after tensions flared to their highest point in 4 years. Within a 24-hour period, Hamas fired over 190 rockets and mortars across the border, while the Israeli Defense Force carried out airstrikes against 40 Hamas targets. The conflict came just days after Israel imposed crippling restrictions on the Strip's main cargo crossing, in an economic retaliatory measure against ongoing Palestinian protests at the Israel-Gaza border. An airstrike that was carried out in the Islamic State-controlled Syrian village of al-Susa has killed 54 people, including 28 civilians. The village has recently come under fire from both Russian and US coalition forces, and a US military representative told Reuters news agency that the coalition may have conducted a strike around the time and vicinity of the incident. The strike occurred on the same day that the Syrian government raised its flag in Dara'ah, marking the official recapture of the province where the war's first uprising broke out 7 years ago. At least 58 people sustained predominantly minor injuries in Egypt when a passenger train derailed as it was en route from Cairo to the southern province of Kenya. A public prosecutor has summoned multiple railway officials for questioning and has ordered the Armed Forces Engineering Authority to carry out an investigation into the incident after 3 of the train's carriages went off the track. The Egyptian government had previously stated that it would require billions of dollars to upgrade the country's railway system, which experienced over 1,700 accidents last year. Amnesty International has called for the abuse of Yemenis in secret prisons run by the United Arab Emirates to be investigated as war crimes. A recent report by the humanitarian organisation details the widespread use of torture, including beatings, electric shocks and sexual violence against scores of prisoners that were arrested and detained for up to 2 years without charge. The UAE has denied any allegations of abuse or involvement in the facilities and continues to be a key member of the Saudi-led coalition involved in Yemen's civil war. In Turkey, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan was sworn in for a 5-year term that marked the beginning of the country's transition from a parliamentary to a presidential system of government. After securing 52% of the vote in last month's elections, the president's new executive powers include the ability to issue decrees and appoint government ministers. The president has described the political transition as essential to the country's stability, but it's also been widely criticised as a way to consolidate power. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow to discuss the most recent developments of the Syrian civil war. The leaders reached a mutual agreement when Netanyahu reluctantly agreed that Israel would not interfere as the Syrian regime regained control over the country. And Russia assured that it had moved Iranian forces away from Israel's border. While Netanyahu was lobbying the Russian president to expel Iran's forces from Syria altogether, analysts highlighted that this would have been unlikely due to Russia and Iran's shared interests in the conflict. Iran witnessed an eruption of public backlash after it was revealed that a 19-year-old girl whose popular social media presence suddenly disappeared in May was arrested for posting videos of herself dancing to Instagram. Public singing and dancing is currently banned in Iran, and followers of Maida Hojabri spotted her on state television being shamed for her behaviour. Conservatives have used the incident to push for a ban on Instagram, and authorities have warned that over 51,000 pages are currently being monitored for any post containing prohibited content. Lastly, the Guinness World Record for the largest jigsaw puzzle was broken in Dubai. The 12,000-piece puzzle spans 6,000 square metres and fittingly was assembled at a construction site where plans to build the world's tallest commercial tower are underway. The installation is 3 times the length of an Olympic swimming pool and was created as part of the Year of Zayed, an ongoing initiative celebrating the 100th anniversary of the birth of the UAE's late founding father. Let's shift pace a bit now to the focus of tonight's episode, understanding Islam. In May 2017, a 14-year-old girl wearing a hijab was on her way to school in England when a passerby shouted, "When are you going to stop bombing people?" And earlier that year, a far-right nationalist walked into a local mosque in Canada and opened fire on worshippers, killing 6 and critically injuring 5. A recent increase in reported hate crimes against Muslims is largely motivated by Islamophobia, a belief that Islam is inherently different from and threatening to Western culture. Fear thrives on the unknown, so let's dispel a few common misconceptions by breaking down some key principles of the world's second largest religion. Islam was born in the 7th century through a series of revelations believed to have been communicated by God to the Prophet Muhammad, a political and religious leader considered to be the final prophet. After his death, some of his followers significantly disagreed over who his successor should be, which established the Sunni and Shia split that exists today. Islam currently has 1.6 billion followers, 60% of which reside in Asia and 20% in the Middle East and North Africa. However, the Middle East and North Africa have the highest percentage of Muslim-majority countries, with almost every country in the Middle East citing a population that is at least 75% Muslim. While the lives of practicing Muslims are culturally diverse, faith is primarily expressed through the 5 pillars of Islam. Shahada, a testimony that must be declared to convert to Islam. Salat, short prayers that are performed 5 times throughout the day. Zakat, an annual donation of personal wealth to aid the less fortunate. Saum, a self-purification food and drink fast from sunrise to sunset in the month of Ramadan. And the Hajj, a once-in-a-lifetime pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca, if it's physically and financially feasible. The Quran, Islam's key religious text, also outlines a series of principles referred to as Sharia. These aren't a body of law, but serve as a recommended ethical guide for Muslims. This includes a modest dress code, which has been interpreted to mean a hijab, chador, niqab, or burqa. While modest dress is socially expected and in certain countries legally required, many women view the attire as a personal way to express their faith. Another principle is the classification halal, which is used to recognise items such as food or pharmaceuticals that are considered acceptable to use. This includes most products unless they're specifically prohibited, such as pork and alcohol. Some culturally conservative countries, such as Saudi Arabia, have incorporated certain Sharia principles into their legal system, but this is referred to as Islamic law and is applied predominantly to family-related cases, such as divorce. Despite a recurring association with Islamic law, female genital mutilation and honour killings aren't referenced in the Quran and are practices that are customary rather than religious, in typically rural communities throughout Africa, the Middle East and Asia.
So you can see that the source of a lot of these understandings that people have about Islam is coming from public discourse, it's coming from political discourse. And there is no doubt that that contributes to this very problematic association of Islam.
Lastly, one of the most common misunderstandings is the everyday Arabic phrase Allahu Akbar, which translates to God is great, and is regularly used by Muslims in times of prayer, celebration and sadness. But in the West, it's become intrinsically associated with terrorism due to its repeated use by extremists, attempting to validate actions that contradict the inherent nature of the religion they claim to represent. Religion is a powerful tool that's frequently manipulated by groups with extremist beliefs in order to spread their own divisive agenda.
Islamic extremist is to Islamic as blank is to Christianity.
The negative and often violent associations that arise from fringe movements can be particularly damaging if they're validated in the political landscape. Some studies have found a correlation between the rhetoric used by politicians following terrorist attacks and the statistical rate of hate crimes. speeches encouraging tolerance prompt a decrease in reported incidents.
Values of love, acceptance, and strength through diversity. In the wake of terror, let us never lose sight of who we are.
While speeches underpinned with divisive language create an environment of distrust, where far-right nationalists are inadvertently emboldened to act on xenophobic beliefs.
I think Islam hates us, and we have to be very vigilant, we have to be very careful, and we can't allow people coming into this country who have this hatred.
The antidote to false narratives around Islam and the dangerous backlash against Muslims is to continue building knowledge and personal connection within local communities. Islam reminds its followers of the importance of discovering and understanding the world we live in, a cross-cultural ideal that's easily forgotten in the midst of tension and conflict, but a worthwhile pursuit nonetheless. We have to go to a break, but stick around as Australian-Egyptian comedian Khaled Khalafalla joins us in the studio to discuss his career on the comedy circuit. Welcome back. Joining us in the studio is Khaled Khalafalla, an award-winning stand-up comedian who's repeatedly performed to local and international sold-out audiences and has acted in numerous film and television productions, including Ali's Wedding and ABC's Upper Middle Bogan. So I know you're on a national stand-up tour. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
Tell me a bit about where you grew up and how you got into comedy.
I had a very eclectic upbringing. So I was born in Saudi Arabia. I lived in 3 different cities in Saudi Arabia, 2 years each. And then I moved to New Zealand and I lived in Auckland and then down in the bottom of the South Island in a place called Invercargill, then back up to mid-North Island, a place called New Plymouth. Then I went to Queensland, Australia. I went to Townsville, lived there for a year, came down to Bendigo on the outskirts of Melbourne, and then came into Melbourne for the last 8 years, I think, yeah. And that's where I started doing comedy. I initially had a journalism background. I was studying journalism, but I started hanging around with one of the journalists who was doing the radio beat at the time, and he went and he introduced me to a lot of people who were doing radio. I got introduced to that world. I really fell in love with entertainment. Someone told me that the best way to get into radio was to do comedy, because you can broadcast, edit, direct, and produce your own stuff, and you get an immediate reaction, and it's something that's highly regarded for everyone in the entertainment industry if you know how to do stand-up comedy. So it was a means to an ends at the start, and then I did it, and I just really enjoyed it and stayed there.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you did. So do you have a particular process for writing new material?
Yeah, I've thought about this many a time, you know, what my process, there's just no process. It's just so haphazard.
Really?
You know, I always have in my head that ideally it would be like there's a story building phase where I'm just experiencing things and I'm reading different things and I'm reading books and I'm getting new ideas. That's the harvesting stage. And then there's the, you know, the writing stage where I try and structure something out of the experiences that I've just put myself into. And then there's the testing out phase where I'll go on stage and I'll do, but you know, that never happens. It's just always I come up with an idea, I go on stage, I test it, it fails, I go back, I try it again, I go on stage, I do it again. While I'm doing that, I read something that I, you know, that inspires me to say something else, and I do that. And sometimes I watch someone else's creative work, and I, you know, they push a boundary that I didn't realize I could do. You hear a sound, you hear music, you have a conversation with someone, just all sorts of inspiration, all at different times, and you just go on from there.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's brave to try it out in an audience for the
I'm
first
very
time.
brave.
Yeah,
I'm
very brave.
very courageous.
What are some of the most challenging and rewarding aspects of stand-up?
It's one of the only jobs where everyone knows, I imagine actually in your job as well, what you're doing now, a lot of people can tell whether or not you're good at your job because they're looking at you while you're doing your job. If you're an accountant, sometimes only the client that you meet on a case-by-case basis will be able to judge you given their experience of you in that immediate moment. But if you're a stand-up comedian, you're doing live audiences, if it's filmed especially, if you're doing specials, if your aim is to try and reach as many people as possible, if you're bad at your job, everyone knows you're bad at your job. And if you're good at your job, everyone knows you're good at your job. So it's both, the exposure is the good and the bad thing, I think, about stand-up comedy.
So you're a Muslim and Arab background. Have you ever encountered any negativity about that?
You know, without becoming too philosophical about it, I think right now, as a Muslim Arab, more than ever, I think the narrative of being a Muslim Arab is very important, and people are really yearning to hear that story, and there are a lot of platforms for that story, more than any time I think in recent history, or in recent memory at least. And so having that platform is really great. And it's really great to be me at the moment and have that unique perspective. At the same time, though, it's easy to fall into the trap of having to play into the existing narrative that people want to hear. So while I have a very unique story that I can tell, there is also a story that I have to express my story within. The narrative exists already for people like me, and for a lot of other Arab Muslims who are in any art form. And so the challenge is to try and push through that and find your unique perspective, and be able to create something that resonates with other Arab Muslims, rather than to try and create the story that you think the structure demands of you, which then just creates a cycle and you're not creating anything new. You've just become part of essentially the colonial perspective of Arabs is. And that's something that I struggle with all the time, pandering to the crowd and saying what I think is going to get the laugh, which is what they already know and what they already expect the narrative is. Or am I pushing boundaries, making people a little bit uncomfortable by telling my most authentic story? So that's, I think, the most pertinent thing that comes into my mind about being an Arab Muslim comedian.
Well, I've watched your work. You're doing well at that.
Do you like it?
Yeah.
Well, you come
I
to a
think
show?
you're funny, yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, no, I
of course.
appreciate
I'll come to your show this week.
Because I'm doing a show Saturday.
Oh,
I'm not
time
sure
for
if
the
you
plug,
know. Can you let everyone know? Just everyone. I'm doing a show Saturday at the Comics Lounge in North Melbourne.
North Melbourne.
www.frontiertouring.com/Khaled Khalafalla. If you're interested, I'm not sure. Are you busy? You're doing another thing?
We'll add that link at the bottom of the screen. Don't worry. So keeping with that, you've performed in the Middle East, right?
I have, yeah.
So how do you compare performing there to performing here? What's the audience like? What's your content like?
Well, I was just another dude there.
Yeah.
You know, like, over here, that's the thing. I'm Khaled Khalafalla here. Do you know what I mean? Like over there, I was like Blake. Like I was just, I was the blonde-haired, blue-eyed dude. I looked like everyone else. So I was, you know, I was in the system there. So I didn't have to really, you know, scrupulously think about my narrative and how I'm going to express it to the people who look at me as the other through this lens of something that's been compounding over time for what they expect of me. I was just a dude. I could talk about anything there, and that was really liberating. But, you know, for upbringing in Australia, you take for granted that you're not part of the privileged majority, and it doesn't affect you in the way that you think it would because you don't realize it for a lot of the time until you go and suddenly you are part of the privileged majority. And that's what happened when I was in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, in Qatar. I finally found myself in a place where I looked like everyone else, where the narrative existed, and I even found myself playing into the you know, the human condition that allowed me to see people maybe in a light that may have been below me, and you slowly fall into that trap of doing that and have to go, this is what it's like to be part of the privileged majority. You've got a responsibility to not fall into that trap and give other people a platform. So I was just the dude. I was just a dude. I was just a dude, you know.
But was it received well?
It was received great.
Yeah,
actually, it was really. The bigger the crowd, you know, the more electric the show. You can't deny that.
Yeah, of course. So, what can audiences expect from your shows?
Recently, they can expect a more authentic version of me. I think I've been striving to be more revealing and more authentic than I have been in my shows. And I've been really trying to give myself the time and the space to create a show that I'm proud of and say something that matters rather than just stick to the schedule of having to do, for example, the comedy festival. So this is a thing that a lot of people might not know, but comedy in Australia, for example, is pretty much constrained to having to do the comedy festivals, and that's where your work is. And they come at a schedule. So it's one of the only disciplines where you're on such a constant schedule to have to create your best work. And over time, it slowly loses its value and its punch if you have to stay on someone else's schedule rather than stay on the schedule of the merit of your own work. Because to put an example, if you're a musician, you don't have touring season or you don't have album season where you have to create the album by the time. Normally people have the time and the space to write what they're proud of and then they decide when to release it when it's finished. So we don't have that luxury in Australia unless you break out of those festivals, which is exactly what I've done for this tour. I've done independent venues in each of the major cities. I'm doing Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane. Hopefully next year I'll do Perth, but I decided to give myself more time and space to write the perfect show, and I finally have that in a way that I think I haven't achieved in the last 7 years. So this is the show that I think reveals the most of me, that I've given myself the time to create. And it's going to be this Saturday in Melbourne and then the following Saturday in Adelaide.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time. We're going to have to go to a break, but thank you so much for coming on and talking about your experience and your tour.
It was my absolute pleasure.
Head to our social media pages for details on Khaled's stand-up tour, which arrives in Melbourne this Saturday night and wraps up in Adelaide next weekend. When we get back, we'll share some tips from a traveller who's had a particularly unique experience in Saudi Arabia. Welcome back. A lot of the content that we cover throughout the show focuses on regional politics and conflict, but we also want to spend a bit of time exploring some of the beautiful destinations and unique experiences that the Middle East has to offer. So to wrap up tonight's episode, we spoke earlier with Tim Addercoat, an Australian children's performer who was cast in a Barney the Dinosaur tour headed for Saudi Arabia.
Okay, can we get brandy? Hi, I'm Timothy Addercoat. I'm an actor, 31 years old, living in Melbourne, Australia. Recently, I got back from 2 separate trips in 3 months to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I went there for an acting job. It was never really on my list of places to visit, but then a job came up and they were willing to pay me to go there, and I thought, I'm not doing anything, so why not go and check it out? And it was fantastic, so much so that I decided to go back a second time, and hopefully I'll go back again later on this year as well. So I was doing a children's show, performing live on stage for the children of Saudi Arabia. It was amazing. We did Barney the Dinosaur World Tour. We did over 24 shows to over 20,000 people. I've been told I've got 7 days before I'm leaving to Saudi Arabia. I did a quick search. Saudi Arabia, war with Yemen. Okay, the first 7 articles. I'm like, And then there's another list that pops up. 112 things you can't do in Saudi Arabia. I'm like, okay. But I got over there, and then it's like, okay, that's only like 47 things you can't do over there kind of thing. So, my favorite place was definitely Jeddah. It's beautiful. The water's amazing. We hired a boat on Christmas and we took a trip out onto the Red Sea. So we spent Christmas Day snorkeling on the Red Sea, which was just beautiful. It was great. It has a reef there, comparable to the Great Barrier Reef. Oh my God, the food. So I was already pretty addicted to hummus before I went there. When I came back, I was like 82% hummus. There's a lot of other foreign influences there. Like we went to a couple of burger places that are like American burger joints. There's just so many there. Obviously the menu's slightly changed. Like I had a McHummus, which was just, no, I'm kidding, I didn't. But imagine if I did. Oh gosh. I in my mind, with Western media and culture, we're kind of taught to assume anyone from that region is going to be potentially up to something potentially dangerous, and it's just not the truth. It's, we went over there and we got treated like royalty, and we were like rock stars. Kids coming up after the show asking for photos and autographs, and it was beautiful. It's not a country that's on a lot of people's bucket lists. It definitely wasn't on mine, but I'm so glad I went. I'm so glad I experienced it. We were so lucky. We stood on a roof in like a souk district in Jeddah and just listened to the call to the prayer, and it echoes. It starts in one location, starts echoing around the city, and then you just hear the chanting and the prayer song, and it was stunning. It's just just listening to it and feeling everything in the city come to that one. Everyone's doing the same thing at the same time in the city, and just realizing that, you kind of go, wow, it's pretty big. It's huge. So I didn't expect to go over there and fall in love with the people and the various places that we visited, and yet I did.
Thank you so much to Tim for sharing his experience. Outside of business and religious purposes, international travel to Saudi Arabia has been largely off limits in recent years. However, the Saudi government introduced a new tourist visa in April in an effort to increase the country's international visitors. There are still some conditions attached, so visit the website below for more information on what to expect when travelling to the kingdom. That's the end of this week's edition. Share your thoughts on anything we've covered on our social media pages, and head to our YouTube channel to catch up on highlights from tonight and previous episodes. Tune in next week when we break down the various systems of government across the region. I'm Gemma Neary, thanks for watching and have a great night.